Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I go on alms on weekdays down at Pike Place. And one practitioner and meditation teacher who's been visiting and coming down on a fairly regular basis was talking to me recently about his past few months. And this teacher has one foot in the Theravada and one foot in the Mahayana. And he was talking about how his, I think his dachshund recently fractured its spine. And they had to take it in for surgery. And in the follow-up to the surgery, he had to make sure that the dog didn't move for 6 weeks. And not just kind of the cone of shame around the head, but actually didn't alter its spinal alignment almost at all. And so I'd noticed that he hadn't come down to talk for the previous 2 months or so. And the reason I learned is because he'd spent the last 2 months sitting with his dog for about 12 hours every day, holding it and meditating and just making sure that it didn't move its spine and break it again. And I don't know if everyone, many people wouldn't have necessarily the ability to do that for various reasons of job or otherwise. But the beauty of such devotion to caring for another being and that path that this teacher basically sat for 12 hours a day with this little dachshund for 6 weeks in a row was one of the more impressive things I've heard of in a long time. And I think speaks to a bit of what we can gain from these different articulations of the path. In some ways, my teacher Ajahn always spoke about how the Theravada, which is the school of Buddhism which the Thai forest tradition originates from, which is focused on the early Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, and how it pairs with the Mahayana, which is an offshoot of Buddhist articulation and another school, which came about 500 years after the Buddha passed, and focuses on a selfless devotion to all beings as its prime articulation. And when my teacher talked about this, he said, it's like two wings of a bird. You have both. You have one wing, the Theravada, and one wing, the Mahayana. And it's interesting because the dichotomy gets, there's something called the narcissism of small differences, and you kind of walk into Theravada circles and then Mahayana circles, and it's like walking into two rival soccer teams sometimes, and everyone kind of makes comments about the other, and it's silly. because there's a wonderful teacher named, or wonderful figure in the past named Xuanzang, who in about 7th century AD China visited India to retrieve the Buddhist texts and bring them back to China again, because he felt they'd been corrupted. And the Buddhism he encountered in India, he classified as Theravada and Mahayana, which meant that there was a lot of interplay and overlap. And in Thailand, I find that's actually more of the picture, is you have monastics practicing the bodhisattva path and monastics practicing for enlightenment in this life. And many, like myself, who don't really know exactly what the path is in terms of that conceptual goal for this specific life, but rather feel drawn by the Dhamma to practice in the way that resonates deepest with us and trust that the Dhamma will guide us in the correct direction. And that in its essence, it seems like those practices between each tradition don't really diverge, at least in the stages of the practice where I am right now, I feel. In that you intuit to an extent which form or teaching resonates with you, and I think you can really trust that without having to really parse out exactly where it's going, because who knows. But the weakening of greed, hatred, and delusion, a cooling of the heart, those are good metrics. And in the end, we do aim for nibbana, for complete awakening. But as to exactly the path that takes through our lives, that's something we all have to kind of figure out for ourselves. And yet there are some really interesting flavors of each tradition. Ajahn Sucitto is fond of saying that the Tibetans have 1,000 prostrations, and the Theravadins, we have 1,000 frustrations, which I think is very good. And just to say that, in a joking way, we sometimes the Theravada has a bit more, we have a lot of lists. There's a certain restraint to some of our articulations of the path. And many of the articulations you come across in the Mahayana circles are sometimes a bit more colorful, which really resonates with people, and sometimes involves some very skillful means of particularly powerful ways to counteract the action of the ego and our tendency to constantly run from suffering. So in the Buddhist practice, there's something called the 4 worldly winds, which are the 8 worldly winds, which are the forces that buffer us or push us one way and the other, back and forth in our lives, of praise and blame, fame and disrepute, pleasure, pain, gain, and loss. And these are winds to let pass over us as much as we're able. And the only way to really do that is to have a refuge in the Dhamma. But sometimes, some of the skillful means that particularly you find in the Mahayana are ways of leaning, in a sense, into the wind to counteract it. So it's almost like what we would hope to do is put a strong foundation post in the ground, and the winds would blow but not move it. And that foundation post is a solidity of purpose, a solidity of practice, precepts, sangha, basically the triple gem as a refuge. But say our post isn't quite solid yet. There's something to be said for leaning it towards those cold winds and actually leaning into them, because that, in a sense, counters them and counterbalances their inevitable push on us. And I haven't memorized these 8 verses yet. I used to have them memorized. But one of the more skillful means are called the 8 verses of mind training. And they're ways of leaning into these winds, in a sense, and using them for our practice. They originated in the 12th century of a Tibetan teacher named Geshe Longri Tangpa. And they are as follows. 1, by thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. 2, whenever I'm in the company of others, I will regard myself as the lowest among all, and from the depths of my heart, cherish others as supreme. 3, in my every action, I will watch my mind, and when the moment destructive emotions arise, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they will hurt both me and others. 4, whenever I see ill-natured beings, or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds or suffering, I will cherish them as something rare, as though I'd found a priceless treasure. 5, whenever someone out of envy does me wrong by attacking or belittling me, I will take defeat upon myself and give the victory to others. 6, even when someone I have helped or in whom I have placed great hopes mistreats me very unjustly, I will view that person as my true spiritual teacher. 7, in brief, directly or indirectly, I will offer help and happiness to all my mothers and secretly take upon myself all their hurt and suffering. 8, I will learn to keep all these practices untainted by thoughts of the 8 worldly winds. May I recognize all things as like illusions, and, without attachment, gain freedom from bondage. So these are the 8 verses of training the mind. And the first, again, by thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. And I think this is a way of leaning into all the worldly winds at once, this first verse. Because so many of those winds have to do with our interactions with others. Praise and blame, fame, disrepute, gain, loss, pleasure, pain. And instead of what this first verse does is it encourages us to, instead of looking at the people around us as sources of fame, disrepute, praise, blame, pleasure, pain, gain, loss, and entities which we push away from or draw towards depending on how well they're meeting those criteria for us or what they're providing us specifically with. What the first verse does by saying that other beings in their role as beings that we get to develop love for are, in that sense, the source of our greatest happiness, because that love and that purpose are the source of true happiness. In that they are precious, regardless of, in whatever specific moment, the valence of the relationship, whether someone is pushing our buttons or praising us, whether they're causing us in our own minds pain or pleasure. They are a focal point of our direction of the heart, of our care. If they're, in that moment, sources of pleasure, of praise, of gain, then fair enough, we can value them in that role and as helpful allies in stabilizing our stance in the world. Because we do need a measure of stability and security and care. It's nice to be praised every now and again. And yet, if they are in the opposite role and sources in a moment of dispraise, of blame, of pain, of loss, then they are a chance and a source of teachings for practice, for purifying our intention and our heart. I've talked about this image you have in the Christian tradition of a spiral staircase, where you have a movement up towards purity of love, and at the same time a movement down the spiral staircase towards purity of heart. And I think of those as the first and third noble truths, in that the spiral staircase down is the first noble truth of encountering again and again our own suffering. And what that does is we see, as we encounter our suffering and let go of its second noble truth, it's a process of seeing the excess that we're adding on to an experience. The angry words we didn't have to say. The extra donut we didn't need to take. Or even a more subtle form of suffering in excess and dilution of our action. And just seeing after a while that when we go out like we used to, it just feels unnecessary, not nourishing in the way it used to, and we can drop it. And so in a sense, that first noble truth and the second noble truth of letting go is separating the grain from the chaff, or the chaff of our life, where we skim off that surface of suffering again and again and purify the essential element of every action, every situation, every intention. And in that sense, it's a spiral down towards purity of heart, because that's what purity of heart is at its most essential, is coming to your most clear core and intention. So that's the benefit of suffering, or of seeing and turning towards our suffering and of letting go of it, is that it's a process of clarifying, of letting go of all the excess time and time again. And in that sense, it's a great gift. So, as other beings are a source of teaching us that, they are something to be valued. As they're a focal point of practice, we hold them, regardless of the exact moment of how we feel towards them, as a treasure. 2 weeks ago, a couple showed up on our Wednesday Zoom session, and one was a young mother who was taking care of her toddler and felt guilty about not getting to meditate as much as she thought she would. And in Dhamma talks, sometimes monks will talk about how, they practice going without sleep and the difficulty of living in community. But after talking to my friends who have gone through the process of raising a toddler, I feel like us monastics have to be a little more humble about this one and acknowledge that that process of raising a kid is an enormous practice in and of itself and is not separate from the path. And that was, I felt, the most important thing to bring up in that moment was, if practice does become divided between this time in seclusion versus this time with others, completely into that paradigm, then yes, the toddler and the child are going to draw you away from what's important. But if there's a vision that others are the route into the path, that we get to reach through these relationships to touch our purpose and path, then they are the most powerful means and they are the conduits to the Dhamma for us. And that's not to say that we don't need to cultivate time in seclusion so that we have the solidity necessary to use every interaction as a means towards purifying the heart, because we need that separation. But it is saying that when we widen the scope of our view to hold others' suffering, then our own suffering seems much smaller within the wider vista of what we're seeing. And that's a gift. The second verse is, "Whenever I'm in the company of others, I will regard myself as lowest among all, and from the depths of my heart, cherish others as supreme." So this is leaning into the worldly wind of praise and blame and fame and disrepute. It's acknowledging that because we don't all have the ability yet to completely ignore those winds, we are buffeted by being praised and blamed. It takes the stance of leaning into it and intentionally conceptualizing oneself as the lowest of all. And obviously this has to be held with care. And for someone with extremely low self-esteem, it might be best put aside for the moment. But if there are times when you can bring this recollection to mind and where it will resonate as the completely correct orientation in a moment, in just thinking of yourself as the lowest the most humble person in a situation, as being with others for the sake of learning and serving and listening, and just that much. And that leaning into that worldly wind by embracing, in a sense, being lower than. Sometimes that's where you find that sense of balance with the winds. It's also a way of making sure that the first verse doesn't lead to conceit. So the first verse of holding all beings in compassion, this is a way of making sure that one doesn't take that on as a justification for pitying others. And pity is the near enemy of compassion. So true loving kindness in Buddhism is not predicated on holding oneself above others, but rather acknowledging others as friends and companions in birth, aging, death, and awakening, and that all beings have this desire. And it has very practical application in that so often we do approach metta practice from this place of more than those around us. We sort of shoot our metta rays at these poor people who need it. And so often it's the quintessential and most important aspect of metta practice is seeing that our own hearts are the ones that are bruised at the moment, and just having the humility to stop and hold our own pain and see that we are the ones who need it the most at that moment. This is especially important when anger comes up, in that so often we try to move past anger by spreading loving kindness towards the person we're angry at, when frequently the most effective route to loving kindness in that moment is instead to see how badly anger hurts, how painful it is to be angry, and just have compassion for oneself in that moment. The great teachers of the past have really held up this aspect of humility. Shu Yun, who was one of the amazing teachers and figures of Mahayana in the past 2 centuries, he was born in 1840 and lived 120 years, well documented. And then on his 120th year, he decided that he'd done enough and passed away after his birthday party. And just an amazing story. If you haven't read about him, he's well worth learning about. His name was Shu Yun, or Empty Cloud. And he basically revived Chinese Buddhism and rebuilt almost every, their major monasteries. And in the latter part of his life, he lived at the central monastery in China after rebuilding it and becoming abbot. But he refused to live in the monastery and instead insisted on living in the pig pen in the back. And after it had been rebuilt, they tried to get him to move into the abbot's quarters, and he refused and continued to live in the pig pen in the back. Ajahn Nisabho, who is one of the most famous teachers in Thailand right now, I'd say. He teaches at the Royal Palace once a month. For his 50th birthday, just a few years ago, he just went to India and wandered alone through the countryside, as all monks do in our tradition, on faith, with nothing, no money, no guarantees of food, no place to sleep. And he said that chance to wander without name or recognition for a month through Kushinagar to the place the Buddha's passed away, unknown, was one of the greatest gifts he's given himself in a long time. And I was lucky enough to get to live near him for a time. And despite being this enormous figure in Thailand, he still lives in this small little hut. And every morning he goes for alms at the same village with the same old ladies offering him the same sticky rice that they have for decades. And even though, after some of those villagers offer him their daily offering, there'll be sometimes 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 people who've driven up from Bangkok to give these luscious offerings they've brought or tried to make. Still, every day, it's just him walking to this village, through this gate, collecting what he can in his bowl. And one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever seen is Longpo Pasano, the abbot of Abhayagiri. He's a giant in the Buddhist world, and yet whenever a senior monk comes, he's suddenly begins or switches into this role of utter humility and service, where he'll immediately go, and Longpor Liam was visiting, and he would bring over trays to Longpor Liam before the meal and see what sort of juice he wanted, and just this ability to hold each role, even the role of abbotship, of teacher, with such lightness, and in every moment to have that aspect of humility as the core. In the time of the Buddha, Venerable Sariputta was known for this especially. He was the chief disciple of the Buddha in terms of wisdom. And the Buddha said that when he passed away, or that just as he'd set the wheel of Dhamma rolling, Venerable Sariputta would keep it rolling. And yet, despite this place at the forefront of the whole Buddhist Sangha, Venerable Sariputta would, after some of his brothers went out for gathering alms, he would stay behind at the monastery and sweep up, just making it look clean so that any lay people who came would feel inspired. He would walk behind the group of monks as they traveled between towns so that he could care for and help the sick and old. He was once admonished by a monk who saw him bowing in the morning to one of the directions. And it was common practice among the Brahmins to bow to a certain direction or to the sunrise. And when this monk brought it to the Buddha and accused Venerable Sariputta of engaging in this superstition, the Buddha said, no, it's that Venerable Sariputta is bowing in the direction of Venerable Assaji, who was the first monk who introduced Venerable Sariputta to Buddhism, to the Buddha's teaching. And so every morning he would bow in the direction of the first individual who had introduced him to this path. He was also admonished by a novice once for not putting on his robe right, and he apologized and corrected it. And it's interesting because this aspect of humility, of thinking of oneself as the most, as the lowest among others, if held correctly, never finishes. The Buddha spoke after his enlightenment about having this thought of who he bows to and takes as his teacher, because everyone needs a teacher, everyone needs to bow to something. And in the end he said, I took the Dhamma as my teacher. And I was talking to someone recently about the fifth precept, which is that against taking intoxicants. And a common point that comes up in the West is that, how strictly do you really have to hold the fifth precept? I mean, it's just a glass of wine. And on one level, it is just a glass of wine. It's not the worst thing in the world. But what I find powerful for those who do choose to hold that a bit more strictly, and this isn't an admonishment to do that necessarily if you're not ready, but the Buddha did really recommend holding these 5 precepts as the basic basis for practice. And what we discussed about with this practitioner was the fact that even though a glass of wine is only a glass of wine on some level, there's a level of surrender with taking the full 5, with saying, okay, it's only that much, and yet I'm just going to take, I know the Buddha praised this, I'm just going to give up completely my sense of negotiating with the Buddha, my sense of trying to wiggle around this or that, and just completely let go into this form and this teaching and this path. And that sense of surrender is not a small thing. So in that sense, a glass of wine isn't a glass of wine, isn't a glass of wine. It can be much more in the sense that it can be surrender versus non-surrender. And once again, this, people have different paths and all in their spiritual trajectory. But just to point out that this aspect of humility, of really consciously humbling oneself utterly and completely to something greater, that motion of the heart is very powerful, and it doesn't just have to manifest towards those around us, but towards the teaching itself. It reminds me of that story I've referenced a few times with Saint Teresa of Avila, where she went off to spend time with the Desert Fathers. She ran away from her home in Italy. She was a noblewoman. And she had 1 coin to buy bread on her way down, or her way off to the desert. And as she was walking out of her home, she heard a voice in her head that said, "Do you have faith in me or in a coin?" And she said, "You, Lord," and dropped the coin. So in that sense, a coin is more than a coin. And these little points of negotiation, and it's interesting to look at them and see, is there a place in any of those parts of our practice where we really know we could surrender completely, and where that would make a difference? And that could be just a decision to be very, very careful with our speech around someone in our life, or to bow to that Buddha image, or an image we care about every morning. But where can we lean into that humility? And where can we acknowledge that the people around us, even and maybe especially when they're difficult for us, are the most essential aspect of our path? And in that representation of the path, can we bow to them and humble ourselves to them? So I think that's enough for now, and that gives us 6 more for next week. And just for reference again, those are the 8 verses of training the mind, and they're pretty well known, so if you Google them, you can find them. They're worth memorizing, which I'm telling myself too, because I need to memorize them. So we have some time for discussion and questions if people have anything they'd like to talk about for a little bit, about this or other issues or topics. And that goes to the live stream as well. People can type in questions. Yeah, Grace.
Yeah, related to your talk with the post and the cement and kind of leaning into the wind, I guess is it, in your opinion, somewhere along the path you kind of give up that lean and you go to just like the firm base? And how does that play into how that you talk about?
Thanks. So the question for the live stream and others is, I spoke about that metaphor of having the post lean into the wind a little bit to achieve a sense of balance. And is there a point on the path where there doesn't have to be that leaning anymore, and where you simply maybe don't use those recollections in the same way and just rely on the solidity of the post. Yeah? My sense, I guess, is that nibbana is, once someone attains awakening, I think these recollections don't have to be brought up in the same way. And for me, it's kind of like keeping one foot in both places. Like, I hadn't looked at these verses in, I first encountered them before I ordained, when I spent a month at Sravasti Abbey, and they were some of the most really profound ones, especially that one on humility. And there's some of the others which had that same power. And I think that, so yeah, I think as one's, at awakening, certainly, they aren't necessarily in the same way. I'd say until then, I think that they could probably be used very effectively throughout the path. I know the Dalai Lama teaches these regularly. I think it's helpful to acknowledge that there is sometimes that sense of solidity of the post where you don't need to always hold those in mind, because as you practice, I think there does become an intuitive sense of the correct path forward. And a lot of times these fairly, they're pretty radical recollections. Like, I conceptualize myself as the lowest of everyone in this room, where it's not as necessary to bring them up, and you can kind of just follow that intuitive path through things. But I find when the winds are hitting especially hard, like most of the time it's enough to move through the world and those around us and have a general sense of loving kindness. But then if you're having a lot of trouble with someone, that's when I find really leaning into the wind and conceptualizing yourself as the lowest and as them as your supreme teacher. That's when it becomes really helpful. And that's when that small difference in orientation between kind of negotiating and, niggling and wriggling around how exactly you're thinking of them and getting caught in the, kind of getting yourself carried away in the imagined argument again. That's where it's so helpful to just put a strong line of whenever that comes up, I'm remembering that they are my teacher now and my biggest teacher. So I think there's different moments for it, but I think when the winds are blowing really strongly, that's when these are so helpful. Yeah. Yeah, John.
Yeah, you mentioned something about letting go of hindrances such as remorse. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how to do that when it's extreme remorse is extremely debilitating, and also with loss, extreme grief, I imagine would be another hindrance. And having difficulty moving on, how best to proceed.
So the question is, in the case of extreme, in the talk spoke about letting go of remorse and the hindrances. And the question is, how can you go about that, especially with extreme remorse or loss, seeing as they're so debilitating and can remain with us through a lifetime, basically. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah.
That's a hard one for the Westerners. I mean, we have our Judeo-Christian upbringing with that nice dose of original sin and guilt. But then also consumerist culture is predicated on making us feel inadequate, and that really sinks in over time. And after a while, the recollecting, when the Buddha spoke about letting go of a hindrance, one of the means he talked about is called the gratification triad, which is seeing the attraction, the drawback, and the escape from any state of mind. And I think it's really important with regret and remorse and the rehashing of that again and again to see the attraction of it. Because there's something really comforting about knowing, about just having that same old thing to chew on. And the sense of control that comes from chewing over it, because there's this sort of delusion that if we go over it again and berate ourselves again, we won't do it again. We'll, control that and make sure it doesn't happen. And it's good to see that maybe that's one of the things drawing us to it. I was speaking to someone about this recently, and there's a lot to be said for just having, the beauty of seeing in meditation how it comes up, and, just seeing the suffering in it and beginning to be able to let it go. And also how a lot of our rehashing, it's based on the mind kind of feeding off of it or orienting around it. And as we cultivate these other wholesome things in our life to orient around, then we have to rely on that less. But we can't expect ourselves to jump to a bright center. We can't expect ourselves to let go of that without first cultivating a bright place to land on. And that's why sila, ethics, and giving are so helpful, is it gives you this bright sense of purpose and self-worth in a really wholesome sense to step into that lets you let go of the darkness a little bit. And it's sort of, I think it's a slow process, but it's also really profound. And even just the pleasure of the breath or loving kindness can really provide a bright space to step into. But I think for really deep remorse, sometimes you have to come up with pretty skillful means. And something like this, one of the Mahayana practices is called the confession of the Bodhisattva's ethical downfalls. And at Sravasti Abbey, this is what they do every morning for about 10 minutes, is it's this long list of confessions, through innumerable lifetimes I have committed wrongs and caused others to commit wrongs. And while you're doing it, you're doing full-length prostrations constantly, again and again and again, which is really hard in these robes. But it's not, it's really powerful. And it's not a practice in self-deprecation. It's bigger than that. Because we are guilty in a sense. We are imperfect and flawed, and there's something to be said for just leaning into that fact if it's held correctly. You could hold all these recollections in an unskillful way, and that's not, if that you're doing that. But there's something to be said for really saying I am guilty and imperfect, and just bowing to that and giving it to the Buddha, giving it up, surrendering it. Because it's bigger than you. And I think this is one of the great insights of Alcoholics Anonymous. Is one of the first steps is giving, acknowledging that you're too small and giving it up. And that's where our triple refuge comes in, is you give all this to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. And I find that's really helpful. And then with deep remorse or loss, also other skillful means like therapy, ritual. There's a really wonderful story of this Dharma teacher at a retreat there was a young man who'd been forced to, by his dad, to put down all these dogs when he was a kid and just shoot them out back. And they'd haunted him for years. And what he ended up doing was creating this stone mandala outside under the constellation Sirius for the dog, and performing this kind of ritual of grief. And sometimes I think substantiating these aspects of forgiveness in ritual and confession are really, really helpful. And that's another great insight of AA, is actually going to these people as much as you can and apologizing, So I think for these really strong threads of remorse, sometimes it can help to really lean into it in that sense, But always held with wisdom and acknowledging like the steady glow of letting go of it little by little as well, Yeah, but I think more people than we imagine are haunted by something. It's kind of the great tragedy of Western spiritual life, is like some of the best people are just absolutely brutal to themselves, and it dominates so much of their lives and personal narrative. It's really hard to see. You talk to a lot of meditation teachers, and on retreat, it's just person after person after person talking about how flawed they are, and it's just heartbreaking,
Thank you.
Yeah. Time for one more, maybe? Is there something from the live stream, Miles?
Yeah, we have Sunyanando asking, does the Theravada or early Buddhist teachings support such humility? I suppose the humility that you were talking about.
So does the Theravada or early Buddhist teachings support such humility as contained in the second verse, I suppose?
And then it actually seems like it might go on. This seems very good, but realistically, some people can be quite toxic and want to put us down, so we fall into depression, gaslighting. How to be humble yet protect oneself from toxic people? Thanks.
How to be humble. Okay, so these are good recollections, but how do we hold them without becoming a doormat and drawing important boundaries as well in our lives with those who are unwholesome influences?
Yes, and it sounds like they're maybe asking if there's like canonical references to something like this.
Yeah, is there canonical references? I think the Buddha spoke consistently about these aspects of humility, although he had different words for it. There's a Pali word called niwato, which means ni is like a negative prefix, and then wato is wind. So it's like not being puffed up. There's also apichayata, which means, api means small, and ichata means wish. So either it's having few wishes, or you can kind of play with it and say it's wishing to be small. It's fun. You can have either one alter the other. And those are frequent references. And you do see the embodiment of that humility in the figures in Buddhism, like Venerable Sariputta, like I mentioned, and in the Vinaya, the Buddhist code, which is the most powerful aspect of that. Just in our code consists of thousands of rules, and yet many, many of those are, or many of the admonitions that have grown up around in the early Buddhist Sangha around how you interact with senior monastics are really clear tools towards cultivating that humility. So constantly serving a senior teacher, for example, taking care of their bowl, how you prepare their seat in the morning. There are very clear means to that. And I think, and yet this explicit and really kind of intense admonition towards how you conceive yourself as the lowest of all, that seems like a skillful means of the Mahayana. And because it's such an extreme articulation, I think it really does have to be held carefully. And if one sees that, it is allowing someone to walk over you or something like that, or you already have a pretty negative self-image, and it's just reinforcing those things, then, you need to probably bring to mind a different recollection. But this is kind of something on the Buddhist path we all have to deal with. There's meditations which are conducive to disenchantment with the world, like the contemplation on the body, which was one of the first meditations that the Buddha really taught to his Sangha. And it led to a large suicide of monks because they were so disillusioned with the body. So after that, he sort of saw that it was really imbalanced, and he taught mindfulness of breathing, the Anapanasati Sutta after that, to brighten the mind and balance things. So even the Buddha was trying to figure out how to help people balance these two sides of the path. And similarly, there's these dichotomies of effort and effortlessness, of activity and receptivity, of living in community and seclusion, and of humility and of self-esteem. And these paradoxes are just run through the Buddha's teaching in so many places. But I think of them like depth perception. It's like you have one eye trained on the drawbacks, or on seclusion, or on the first noble truth of suffering. And you have the other eye trained on self-esteem, on living with others skillfully, on morality, on the third noble truth of peace. And because you have both eyes seeing at the same time, you see a full picture. But it takes skill to figure out how to navigate that, and that's a large part of what we're cultivating in these initial stages. So, yeah, these practices should be held with care. But if used skillfully, they're a powerful means. And I just finish that by saying that I think one of the most powerful routes to humility I've seen in the canon is the teachings on dependent origination, where it speaks about how all conditions originate from other conditions. And when you see things that way, it just allows this sense of anatta, of not self, to really sink in, where all the good qualities that you embody are, in a sense, gifts from others. They're these sankharas, these embodiments, these formations that you've taken and been given. And they're gifts that you have to steward and care for and give to others as well. And it's hard to feel that much arrogance around something you're just caring for so that you can give to another. So anatta at its sense is, at a deep sense, moves us towards that deep ground of humility. But it's a gentle path, whereas this is a quite, you're really leaning into the wind with these verses, but there is a place for them, I